Hi everyone, my name is Claudia Chwalisz. I'm the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext, which is an international foundation working to accelerate the spread of high quality, empowered, and permanent citizens' assemblies. I've been working on democratic innovation and deliberative democracy for close to 15 years in different guises. Before founding DemNext, I established and led the OECD's work on the future of democracy and innovative citizen participation. When I was there, I led a big study that culminated in the OECD's Deliberative Wave report, which some of you may have come across. Was also involved in setting international standards of good practice, evaluation guidelines, and I've been involved in the design of the world's first permanent assemblies that have a legal basis. One of those is in Paris, which I'll focus on in this short lightning talk. So I was involved in the design of the Permanent Paris Citizens Assembly in 2020, together with a group of other experts that included the Federation for Innovation and Democracy's Yves de Jager and the G1000's David van Reebrouck, amongst others. And on the basis of our design proposals, the Paris City Council voted to update its governance regulations in 2021, establishing the Permanent Paris Citizens Assembly. The regulation details various aspects of how this works. I decided to write the essay for this series, focusing in particular on the final phase of the process, which is a genuine co-creation exercise between the assembly members, elected officials, and members of the public administration. Because as far as I know, this is unique in the world. It's led to real impact, with the output being a citizen bill that was voted and adopted by the Paris City Council in 2021. And nothing, again, as far as I know, has been written or shared more widely about this yet, because it's still quite a recent development. So the paper that I've written draws largely on my own experience, actually, of being involved in the design of this process, and then also observing it as a member of the oversight committee, which I'm still a part of now. So over that time, I've had various conversations with some of the assembly members, as well as key people that were involved in the process over these years. Also on the political side of things, like the vice mayor for participation, Anouche Torognon. And I complemented this with doing a more formal in-depth interview with the General Secretary of the Citizens Assembly, Elian Bollon, to understand his perspective on this as well, because given the permanence of this and his role, he really plays a very crucial role in this whole process. So I thought it was worth the focus because, to me, in many ways, what Paris has done and is doing now is a bit the new gold standard. So at DemNext, in the projects that we're working on with governments, as well as with other kinds of institutions, this is the approach that we're encouraging public authorities to take. So, why is this different? Well, what typically happens with a citizens' assembly is that the assembly is commissioned by a public authority. It does its work, meaning it learns, it hears from experts, it deliberates, and then it drafts its recommendations. And that's a bit of that final phase then of that part of the process. It hands over the recommendations to the authority that commissioned the assembly. That authority then goes away, takes some months to review those recommendations, works out which ones they'll accept, won't accept, how will they implement them and when, and so on. And then they come back and they respond to the assembly, sometimes with a formal written set of responses. Sometimes they also reconvene in person with the assembly members to have a bit of a dialogue around this. But ultimately then those recommendations that have been accepted go on to land on the desks of various parts of the civil service tasked with implementing them. Sometimes with a kind of oh, what is this and where is this coming from kind of reaction. So the design of the Paris process is really intentionally done to engage with both power and politics, and to have a better assurance that whatever happens with those recommendations really does lead to implementation. So how does the Permanent Paris Citizens Assembly work, and how is it different to what I've just described? So let me take last year's cycle and the work they did to draft the citizen bill as an example. So the Assembly has 100 members that are selected by sortition to be broadly representative of the people who are living in Paris, not necessarily just French citizens. And over the course of their 9-month mandate, so it starts in September and goes until July of the following year, they work in 2 working groups. So one of those working groups is going to commit to spending more time over the course of those 9 months to draft a citizen bill. And another working group is going to spend less time developing what could be called just policy proposals that have a bit less of legal kind of bindingness to them, or a bit less precisely defined. So for both cases, though, there's an agenda setting role to start with. So the whole assembly gets to decide what will be the issues that each of those working groups will focus on. For the citizen bill, the city government first puts forth three different issues that they would be willing and needing to consider a citizen bill on. So in this case, if we take last year's cycle, they had the choice of working on either advertising in public space, municipal policing, or homelessness. So to be able to decide, they first received a short briefing, had a Q&A also with some key people involved in each issue. They deliberated amongst themselves, and then they voted. And in this instance, they voted to focus on the issue of homelessness. And then for the other working group that will work on policy proposals, they generated various ideas bottom up. They deliberated on those and they voted. And in this instance, they chose to work on proposals to do with greening the city. Now, let's zoom in to the citizen bill group because this is the part that's really unique about this process. So first, just to also give the context of the fact that they had 11 working sessions for learning and deliberating in small groups, 7 site visits, 5 plenary sessions where they reconvened with the whole assembly. And at the end of that process, they came up with an initial set of 43 recommendations. Now, in a typical citizens' assembly, this would have been the end of the process. They would have handed off those recommendations over to the political side of things and await their response. So what was different is that in the permanent assembly in Paris, this is just the end of phase 3 out of 4 phases. So the last phase is a series of 3 facilitated workshops with assembly members, elected officials, and civil servants. So together, they did the work to be able to find consensus and transform those initial 43 recommendations into what ended up being 20 articles in the citizen bill. So many of those recommendations in some ways were kind of transformed or combined or slightly altered in this phase. There was only one recommendation from that initial set that didn't make it in any form into that final text. And this was the compromise that the assembly members were willing to take in order to have the rest of that text agreed upon and passed, in terms of like not being a sticking point, blocking the entire thing from getting traction and being accepted in the first place. So that bill was then put forth in that final form, agreed upon by all parties, because the assembly members did vote amongst themselves and they reached full consensus that they were, as an assembly, behind that final citizen bill that was co-constructively drafted by all involved. So the vice mayor for participation, Anoush Torognon, was the one who kind of formally brought this in and put it forth for debate and a vote in the Paris City Council. And this was back in July 2024, and it passed. So this is a historic first time ever that we've seen a legal text being drafted in such a way. And I think it's a beautiful precedent for us to be inspired by, and that we can aspire for other citizens' assemblies in the future, especially if we're concerned about wanting to ensure there is a strong link between what citizens are proposing and their eventual implementation by public administrations with a strong political backing behind them as well. So my paper also brings forth a few considerations for adapting the Paris model to a Canadian context, which in many ways is based on me being a Canadian, having grown up in Toronto and being aware of the various other things to take into account, like, you know, there's bilingualism, the very federal nature of politics, the need for meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples. But none of those things, I think, really detract from the general point about ensuring the design of a final phase of co-creation and actually co-decision as well. So that's a bit of the summary of what I was writing about, and I'm sorry that I couldn't join you in person to be able to dialogue about this as well, even synchronously for this workshop, because, well, the Vancouver front's time zones are not the most amenable for that, but hopefully there will be another occasion to meet and exchange. So thank you also to the Centre for Media Technology and Democracy, and also the Mila Quebec AI Institute at the University of McGill for organizing this essay series and this workshop, and for inviting me to be a part of it.